Beautiful day in Chicago. Not sure who's in charge of that, but I'll take them when I can get them. So I've been working on the punch list of improvements on the car for the past couple of days. So some progress to show for it. First, I ground down a little bit of the strut bar here just to increase the clearance between it and the hood. And I just put some touch-up paint on it. I also drained the coolant and I shortened this hose here, about 3/8 of an inch. And then when I reconnected it, it pulls it back. So that gave me about a finger breadth of clearance between the hose and the fan blades. That should be enough. I also started working on the rear bumper to tuck it a little more. That was the goal. Here's the layout on the car itself. So this is the frame rail, the TT's frame rail that I boxed off of the plate of 11 gauge steel that has 3 bolts welded on the backside. The upper 2 are short. The bottom one's long, so that when I put the bumper on, the bracket hangs on this bolt, which guides the bracket in without worrying about having the bracket slip and chip the body. Here are the new brackets. They're basically the same as the old ones, just 1 1/4 or 1 3/8 shorter, which tucks the bumper more. They're rigid, but it's really the same layout that the TT had. The TT's rebar was bolted directly to the end of the frame rail, which is just as rigid or more. So I don't think this is optimal. I don't think the rebar should be rigid, but that's the way they did it, so that's the way I duplicated it. In their defense, their rebar was aluminum and maybe it collapses when it gets hit. This steel one won't. So basically my plan is to not get rear-ended. That's probably everyone's plan. So maybe it's not such a good plan. That's the way I did it. In order to shorten these brackets 1 3/8 and not change the alignment of the bumper, I made a quick jig. The way that works, it looks like I just welded 3 bolts to these pieces of steel, but the way I did that was to actually bolt these before they're welded to anything. I bolted these to the plate, the original plate, the one that I cut off and have since discarded. That way I know the bolts are in a perfect position to duplicate what's on the car. And then I just turned the whole bumper rebar. I turned the whole bumper rebar over onto this jig, and then blasted some tack welds to connect the bolts to this steel in a way that I know these bolts exactly duplicate what's on the car. Then I went ahead and made new brackets, this part that you see here, and bolted them to the jig. So now I know these brackets will fit perfectly on the car when it's time to put it all back together. Then it's just a matter of setting this rebar in the correct position on this jig, and I just did that basically using machine blocks to set the position of the original bumper, and then by removing 1 3/4 1 3/8 worth of machine blocks, that automatically lowers the rebar so that it's 1 3/8 closer to the jig. And then when I take the whole thing off, when I weld it and take it all off, bingo, it fits perfectly. So that's how I did that. There's probably other ways to do it, but that was the quickest way for me. So I'll tear down this jig. I'll cut these bolts off. This was actually my rotisserie metal, so I'll keep that. So here are the new brackets. I've already test fit everything. I know if it's okay. In order to be able to bolt this bumper rebar on from underneath, I did cut away the lower part of the bumper rebar. So this metal here is to come up quite a bit further. That's all gone. And then while I was at it, I cut a little bit of the top off to make sure that I had enough clearance between this front lip and the car. Interestingly, cutting all that off took a lot of time and took only 8 pounds off the bumper. So it was 32 pounds complete before. Now it's still 24 pounds. So I'm not sure that I'm going to make the car perform much different by spending hours and hours nibbling metal here and there. I might do it, but it's not going to be a priority. The skin itself normally snaps into the bumper rebar using these sort of peg-like projections. And these normally have a profile so that when you push the skin onto the bumper rebar, the pegs, sorry about the lighting, they go through these holes and they snap in. I actually trimmed the profile so that these no longer snap in. The reason I did that is because this bumper was damaged and I did what I could to straighten it and it looks okay. But at some point, if I stumble on a better skin, I just want to be able to take this one off easily. And with the snapping mechanism still in place, you really can't get the skin off of the rebar without taking the rebar apart and then one by one releasing these pegs. The way this is, I'll be able to just pull the skin off when I'm ready. To keep the skin on, I'm going to drill holes through these pegs and then run a zip tie through the peg that'll just keep the peg from backing out. It's not going to be zip tied to the bumper. The zip tie will just act like a cotter pin. And then when I'm ready, I can just snip those and the skin will come off. The sides of the bumper skin are held to the car with these little sliding brackets. This bracket can slide back and forth. This is the correct position now for my tucked bumper alignment. It's still contained within these sliding rails, but you can see it's almost off the end. So I've really tucked the bumper quite a lot. And then the end here is trimmed to accommodate the arch of the car that sticks out. I don't bother to close the end. I'll clean that edge up, but I don't bother to close it because the open end is nicely obscured by the protrusion of the arch. Just as an aside, these little sliding brackets, this is the other side, they're often broken. It's a piece of plastic with an M8 thread on it, and the M8 thread is molded into the piece and oftentimes breaks off. This one is broken off through no one's fault but my own. I was just rough handling it yesterday and I broke the end off. Now on a meticulous restoration, you'd want to replace this. But for a car like this, I think it's fine to just drill a hole and thread in an M8 bolt. This could conceivably rust because there's the potential that road spray could hit it. In my case, I don't think that'll happen because I don't plan on ever getting this car wet. And for any of you who also love Mark 1 Sciroccos, I don't recommend you get them wet. You may or may not be aware, but these cars, they're actually made of a substance they pretend is steel, but it's actually more akin to paper mache. And if you get this part of the car wet, the so-called body, even to wash it, it'll just melt away. So don't do that. So if you follow that rule, this bolt will never get wet and it'll never rust. But if in spite of that you do plan to get the car wet, you can put some anti-seize on here. And even if it does seize, you can take the bumper off and this will slide out and stay with the car, and then you can grab it and work it loose. But anyways, that's how I fixed that. There's Cosmoline. That's that shine that you see there on the plate. I've also put it on the bracket here. People who know me know that I love Cosmoline. Here's Cosmoline. Look at this stuff. It's fantastic. It's liquid like this when it's hot. When it cools to room temperature, right now it's in the sun, so it's liquid. When it cools to room temperature, it's actually thick. So I could stand this brush up in the Cosmoline. So I'll let this cool off. I'm going to put some on this last bracket here. Normally I would let that cool off so it's thicker when I put it on. Obviously, when I get the car out in the sun, it's going to get thin again like that, which is why anyone who sees one of my cars right after I build them knows they stink, because they smell like cosmoline that's slowly gassing out. In time, it will dry the way we're familiar with. But this was a full gallon. You can see how much of it I've used, and that was painted inside everywhere I could get to. Everywhere I couldn't get to, I sprayed 3M cavity wax. So this car has a lot of various chemicals still evaporating. So you can't tell today on the video, but you just have to take my word for it. The car smells. But anyways, I'll go ahead and install this rebar, and I'll zip tie the skin to it first. I'll tear down my jig here so that my bars are back to the way they were before, and then I will follow up with a finished bumper video.